there have been quite a few legislative changes to support, infrastructure projects in certain sectors. And some of those changes have included government support, which is obviously quite key, for certain projects to take off. And others have included incentives and tax, benefits, like, for instance, in the renewables sector, where you get, feed-in tariffs for different renewable sources nowadays. And that was not the case in the old days in Turkey. With the new RES law, which is not new anymore, it compares quite well to the European nations, I would say, because it fixes a feed-in tariff for each renewable energy source. And before, we only had one feed-in tariff for all kinds of renewable energy sources. And it also brings about other incentives, for instance, reduction in fees for grid connection capacity. And also, certain tax incentives depending on where your project is going to be located and the like. And if you look at the major infrastructure projects, some of them do have some form of government support. In the social infrastructure, hospital projects, you know that the Ministry of Health is actually the counterparty to the implementation agreements. So there you have the government, and not only a certain directorate of the government, but the government with the ministry as a counterparty to termination payments and, obviously if it goes very wrong, or to availability payments if the project continues on a healthy path. So it does compare quite well in those types of industry sectors. And especially the healthcare projects, they do follow very much the UK PFI documentation, I would say. Infrastructure bonds, they don't really exist yet, I would say, in Turkey. Because what you're talking about is a project bond. Okay? I mean, there have been some bond financings of some of the projects in the market in, again, different industry sectors. But the classical type of project bond, as you see it in Canada, okay, for instance, which is the forerunner of those jurisdictions when it comes to project bonds, is really non-existent at the moment in Turkey. There is one provision in a law which talks about project bonds, but it's a very limited provision, and it needs to be backed up by secondary legislation, or at least, in certain cases also primary legislation, for project bonds really to become a reality. I mean, obviously, some of the criteria you can never change with a change of legislation, like the credit rating. Okay, it will always remain sovereign credit rating. So, if the sovereign credit rating is low, then there's not much you can do with that. But other things you may change. When it concerns infrastructure projects, you could actually change legislation in a way so that some of the implementation documentation takes account of other financing methods, okay? Because currently in most of the implementation agreements where a public entity is involved, we only see bank financing as, the source of financing. For a bond financing to really kick off, you need a different procedure. And that needs to be taken care of. And also, I think the capital markets are still at very, very baby stages in Turkey. So, a lot needs to happen in the capital markets legislation for these project bonds really to become a reality and an alternative also to bank financing, which they currently are not. I mean, we have looked at project bonds with EBRD, and there was a seminar in London a few years ago, and where government officials came and they spoke about the possibility of the capital markets becoming some form of alternative financing of these very large projects. Canadian law firms came, and Canadian lawyers spoke about how they implemented project bonds in their jurisdiction, and we did speak. But at the moment, I think the capital markets need to be more developed for this to be any kind of alternative. And we hope that, with the Istanbul Stock Exchange undergoing some form of reformation, and which is also public knowledge. I mean, EBRD perhaps also purchasing a stake in the Istanbul Stock Exchange in the near future. This may actually become a reality, which it isn't at the moment. Instead of looking just at the capital markets, I look at it from a wider perspective. I think there needs to be some reforms to boost confidence again in foreign investors in particular. Because in recent weeks, or I would say in recent months, we have always been asked the same question, by foreign investors. So where is Turkey going, in terms of politics, in terms of economy, in terms of financial, stability, in inverted commas? And we had a bit of a difficult time with the recent elections, and now a repeated election this time around. And for the past 4 months, I can say from our perspective that it slowed down quite a lot in terms of new investments, slowed down because everybody was waiting to see what was going to happen in the very recent elections now. And I think what needs to happen also is boost a lot of investor confidence in the structures. Because let's face it, I mean, these very large projects, they do require some form of government intervention, be it on the permitting or licensing stage, be it, if you need to sit across the table with a public entity to sign a contract. At any stage of these projects, there needs to be some form of government involvement. And what investors are looking out for is transparency, okay, in how these, if they are tendered these projects, how the tenders are effected. And at the implementation stage, also transparency in terms of when will I get what permit. And it's obviously we can tell them, you need to get these documents ready and you need to submit these documents to blob entity at blob time. But they wish to see more transparency in the timeline also. And also, certain issues they ask a lot, which are more political in nature. I'm not going to now, go into politics here. But I think what needs to happen is to boost that investor confidence and to continue, attracting foreign investors into the country. It's not so much on the, on the overall legal framework of these projects, but some of them have got a very sound legal framework in place, actually, if you talk about the hospital, investments, for instance, or if you talk, as I said before, in the renewables market, we have got a very sound legal framework in place. But it's more at the implementation stage, the practicality of how to implement these projects, that needs to be more transparent from what we hear from foreign investors. We find it's the event which is attended probably by most people are flying in, and which they don't for some events. And we tend to see quite a few, of our clients here, quite a few bankers, quite a few sponsors. I mean, clients from all over. It's not only banks or IFIs or ECAs, but it's also more and more it's attracting also sponsors and borrowers to come to this event. And I would say it's really one of the events, and there are only a few in this market, where people are flying in, and where actually a majority, of people are flying in to see the event. So that's what I can say about this, and it's obviously a very good marketing tool for us to see those people. Because you exchange ideas with people, it's and the topics. The more you talk about a certain topic, the more it becomes an agenda for private investors, for banks, for government officials, all who are needed actually to what we have also spoken before about to generate some form of reform in a certain area. So that's why you need to speak about these topics constantly for them to be on the top of the agenda.